salt, salt sea, all for the love of thee. I could have married the king's daughter dear, she would have married me, but I have forsaken her crowns of gold, all for the love of thee. Well, if you could have married the king's daughter dear, I'm sure you are to blame, for I am married to a house carpenter, and find him a nice young man. Oh, will you forsake your house carpenter and go along with me? I'll take you to where the grass grows green, to the banks of the salt, salt sea. Well, if I should forsake my house carpenter and go along with thee, what have you got to maintain me on and keep me from poverty? 6 ships all out on the sea, 7 more upon dry land, 110 all brave sailor men will be at your command. She picked up her own wee babe, kisses she gave him 3, said stay right here with my house carpenter and keep him good company. Then she put it on her rich attire, so glorious to behold, and as she trod along her way, she shone like the glittering gold. Well, they'd not been gone but about 2 weeks, I know it was not 3, when this fair lady began to weep, she wept most bitterly. Fair young maid, weep it for your golden store, or do you weep for your house carpenter, who never you shall see any more? I do not weep for my house carpenter, or for any golden store. I do weep for my own wee babe, who never I shall see any more. Well, they'd not been gone but about 3 weeks, I'm sure it was not 4. Our gallant ship sprang a leak and sank, never to rise any more. One time around spun our gallant ship, 2 times around spun she, 3 times around spun our gallant ship, and sank to the bottom of the sea. What hills are those, my love, that rise so fair and high? Those are the hills of heaven, love, but not for you and I. And what hills are those, my love, those hills so dark and low? Those are the hills of hell must go, where you and I must go.
A story is true, a story is untrue. A story is a work of transformative fiction. As time extends, it matters less and less. Hello, I'm Kendra Spring Classic, and welcome back to Reading Between the Lines, a podcast by fandom nerds for fandom nerds. This podcast is all about fan fiction, the much-maligned art form that, nevertheless, brings many people cathartic levels of joy, not just in the reading of it, but in the creation of it as well. If this is your first time listening, welcome. We're so glad to have you. But be sure to go back and listen to our previous episodes. These are evergreen stories, which can be revisited again and again. You're certain to discover something new each time. I know I have. In last month's episode, I spoke with the Waverly chapter of the philanthropic educational organization at the behest of my friend Vicky Coffin about fan fiction in general, spoke about the origins of this podcast, and made my case for fan fiction as a valid and vital form of literature. This month, I sat down with the charming and utterly engaging Dr. Alex Tankard, a professor of English literature, as they would be called in the States, or simply Alex, as they prefer to be addressed here, to talk about Black Sails from a literary context, and boy did we cover some ground with this one. We aren't discussing a specific piece of fan fiction this month, though we do touch on the process, but we will discuss the cathartic and very intimate process of transformative work and authorial choices in this interview. It's fitting this month that we take on the series as a whole and postulate on what some of the literary influences may have been in the writer's room, as this episode is being released on the 10th anniversary of Black Sails' series premiere. Some of you have come to Black Sails via the Percy Jackson pipeline, and to you, I offer a hearty welcome. But be warned, in this podcast, there be spoilers. Grab a hot beverage, cozy up by the fire, and kick up your feet. You are in the very best of hands with this team, and if you think Poseidon gave you daddy issues, he's got nothing on Flint. I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Alex Tankard onto the podcast at long last. So let's waste no more time and let's dive right in. Well, welcome to the podcast. Dr. Alex Tankard is here with me. I'm so glad that you can join me. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Finally, I've been battling various viruses since October, so I think I'm finally in the clear. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your academic background and where you teach, and we can go from there.
I teach in a small university in the northwest of England. I'm mainly a 19th century person, but I haven't even read Treasure Island until Black Sails. I've managed to avoid it, and I hate Muppets Treasure Island. I'm really freaked out by Muppets. It took me about 4 attempts to get through it because I felt physically ill because Muppets freak me out so much. So there's no good reason why I should be interested in Black Sails. But yeah, I mean, we'll talk a bit later about kind of how I got into it through a really weird direction. But my main research for my PhD was on tuberculosis in 19th century literature and culture, and disability politics, disabled identity emerging in the 19th century. But I suppose the thing that's more relevant is for my master's dissertation, I wrote about characters in 19th century literature who shouldn't be alive, like Frankenstein's monster, Heathcliff, and Little Father Time in Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. So that probably explains part of my interest in Black Sails when we kind of talk about it in more detail later. So yeah, my background's mainly 19th century literature, but then I took a bit of a dive I started reading fan fiction for pleasure and started watching Marvel movies and wrote an essay on eugenics in Captain America movies. So I've taken a bit of a divergence away from my very traditional sort of literary background, although I never really was. I was always very interdisciplinary. I was interested in history of medicine and disability, into television and things, even though I have no training in analysing television or film. So it's all feels like I'm on the edge of a frontier for me and trying to catch up with other people on these things. I only discovered fandom, Archive of Our Own in my 30s. So like you, I was kind of really late coming to fan fiction. I've still never written fan fiction, but I didn't grow up with the internet, but you know what I mean? It's something I've only discovered in much later life, and I'm too shy now to get involved with those communities. I sort of hover at the edge, just reading things.
Well, yeah, I didn't get involved in it until much later either. And though I have a background in creative writing, short stories and poetry and things like that, to me, the idea of fandom writing, fanfic writing is terrifying, because you're going into a work already with all of these expectations set in place already. I don't know. I thought about it, but the idea just terrifies me.
It's not the writing of it that bothers me. The writing of it really interests me because I'm interested in transformative work, and a lot of the things that I teach are texts that are interlinked, that have transformative relationships with each other, even if it's only in quite a broad thematic way, but sometimes quite directly. So I'm interested in that whole process, but it's the thought of someone reading it that stops me. I couldn't write something and have someone read it, and it's ridiculous because I'm a published writer in my own field. Well, I do feel physically sick if if my book comes out and I see, people are supposed to be thrilled when they see their name in print for the first time. I was mortified. I couldn't bear it because it meant that I now officially exist. And after I die, there's something with my name on it. I hate that. I hate that so much. But at least with fanfic, you could write with a pseudonym. But no, it's the thought that someone would read it and have an opinion on it and give feedback on it. I would just die. I couldn't do it. So I admire people's courage who can do it, because it's too intimate. I think that's what it is. If I'm writing something academically, there's a little bit of critical distance. But with creative writing, it's far too intimate. It's far too exposing. And I don't want to expose that side of myself to other people's criticism. I'm just too cowardly for that. I can't do it.
Yeah. There is a very deep connection with our own psychology and our own trauma and things like that I think go more hand in hand with fanfic writing than with normal fiction.
Because you're making a critical choice, aren't you?
Yeah.
With the transformative work, you are making a really deliberate choice. Whereas if you're doing creative work, nobody knows exactly what the process was there. But with the transformative work, you are making a really visible choice to other people, and they know that you've changed something. And if you've changed something, it's revealing a lot about you and your wish fulfillment and your desires and what you want.
That is so true.
It's far too revealing. It's mortifying. Yeah. So congratulations to everyone who can do it.
Yeah, it's a very brave undertaking. Yeah, because you are saying so much about yourself with everything that you write. So you said that you didn't read Treasure Island until after you got into Black Sails. How did you discover Black Sails?
Like a lot of people, it was in lockdown, but I'm mortified again with this. So when Black Sails was on, I was teaching a module on romanticism with a big R, so the cultural movement from the 18th to 19th century, rather than romance with a small R. And I was teaching Byron, and I was ranting about the relationship between Byronic Satanism and the Byronic anti-hero and Paradise Lost, Milton's poem from the 17th century. And how I wish there was a film adaptation of Paradise Lost, and it needs to be really, really queer, and Satan needs to be really hot, and it needs to be done from the kind of romantic perspective, which was that the romantic poets kind of deliberately reappropriate the figure of Satan, not as a villain, but as a revolutionary anti-hero, tragic anti-hero, and God as the tyrant who has to be overthrown by this revolutionary. And this definitely needs to be in a film. Oh my God, will you please just watch Black Sails? You've got to watch Black Sails. I was going, I don't know, I'm not watching Pirates. I don't like Treasure Island. I don't like, I'm sick of Pirates of the Caribbean. I'm not watching that. It sounds stupid. And I was saying, well, they were trying to explain Captain Flint to me. I was like, well, as like Satan. I was going, well, who's playing it? Oh, Toby Stevens. Like, no, I'm not watching that. It sounds stupid. That's ridiculous. How on earth could you have Toby Stevens playing basically Satan? This is ridiculous, because I'd only seen him doing comical, goofy stuff. And then I was ranting again, as I always do, about I really want to see a representation of queer history that actually commits to how different queer experiences were in historical contexts, how the sex of one's partner was usually not the organizing principle of one's sexuality or identity. It was, in some cases largely irrelevant. And how, in the 18th century, for example, there was no reason why a man, just because he'd had sex with a man, wouldn't be married to a woman. It wouldn't even be it wouldn't be an identity crisis. It would just be, here's a thing that I do. Also, I have a wife. These things wouldn't be inconsistent in this. Will you please watch this show? Please. Somebody has done this. It's right there. Will you watch it? And I didn't, and I didn't, and I didn't. And then I watched it in lockdown. And even then I was only half watching it, because as we discussed, the pilot, there's quite a lot of noisy and foolish content in the pilot. But I think, the moment when they start saying Captain Flint is undead and walks the earth without a soul and is baptized in the blood of infants, I thought, okay, this has been written specifically for me. Clearly, this is all my fantasies have come true at once. And then, during lockdown, I made a pirate coat. That was my little sew. I've never sewn anything before. I started with 18th century tailoring, which is not a clever starting point. But now I make pirate shirts as well, because those are easy to make. So that's my contribution to fan works, is sewing, not writing. Although I'm writing on it in other ways.
Yeah, and I have seen, I think Lecky has one of your pirate shirts.
Yes. Yeah,
yes, those are awesome.
Making for a friend that's been unfinished for a really long time, so in a lot of trouble. Now my cousin's little boy has asked me to make one. I really like making for small children because it's a tiny miniature one, and you can use cute fabric and things like that. But yeah, that's what I'm doing. So that's what I'm doing instead of fanfic. But I also gave a talk at a conference recently on Black Sails, which got a lot of laughs, which isn't necessarily what you want. Nobody asked any questions. People were just laughing, but I did put Pingu in it, to be fair. And I did tell people that the subtitle was Horny for Darkness. So I feel like I lowered the tone of the entire conference, I think. But I did finally get to talk about Black Sails in an academic context.
I think if you introduce that to people who have seen Black Sails in terms of a more academic setting, I think the laughter would die down, because there's so much there. Everybody laughs because it's a pirate show, but once you get past the first season, it's remarkable. I've never seen anything like it in terms of themes and richness of the writing and the complexity of the characters. In fact, that there are no clear-cut villains other than the British Empire. Even Woodes Rogers is romanticized a little bit.
I'm on a rewatch at the moment, and I'm in season 4, and I think it's remarkable that I don't hate him the most of anyone in it. He's in the position of the villain, or he has that conversation with Flint about being put in the position of the villain. But I dislike him a lot less than some other people, because he's there to do a thing, and he's doing the thing. Yeah. Which, he's fulfilling the function he was put there for. But yeah, although I think we all talk about our misgivings about aspects of season 1, and I know you and I have talked about it, and the really, really visible, even from my very ignorant perspective, really visible interference that's you can see of trying to capture certain audiences who perhaps are not the ideal audience for a show that is so committed to queer experience and, the particular politics as it develops.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I don't mean to be critical when I say I find the show very uneven throughout. I think there's about, I won't say what percentage, but a huge percentage of, explosions and nudity and rollicking around in boats and things like that. And then there's about a small percentage that is the most sophisticated representation of the romantic satanic tradition, literary tradition I've ever seen on screen. And I think, how has that happened? How has that happened in the middle of everything else? This is incredibly sophisticated and fully functional literary exploration of this particular literary tradition is happening. So I'm giving away here, this is actually what my interest is in the show, is this particular literary thing. But the other aspects of the show that the more I rewatch, the more I appreciate. Like the first time I watched it, I hated Vane right up to the moment he died, because he seemed like a bit of a playground bully. He winds up Flint a lot, and Flint's really easily wound up, so I don't think there's any credit deserved for that. But then I kind of went back and I appreciated what that character was doing and thought it was much more interesting. But I'm afraid I'm never going to be interested in young people relationship dramas in any show ever. So I only want to see depressed middle-aged people. I don't care about young people falling in love, falling out of love, falling in love again. I'm too old for that. I only want to see, Mr. Gates fretting about his bad knee. That's the kind of content I'm here for, is old people stuff.
Yes. The older I have gotten, the harder it is for me to relate in any way to, teenage drama, like anything set in high school. I really, really wanted to watch and appreciate Heartstoppers. And I have so little time that if it does not grab me, I have a hard time going further. Just once they were so baby faced. And I got a half episode through, and I was just like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to connect to this in any way.
I tried with Heartstopper because there's reasons why I need to watch it, because I'm writing about asexuality, and I can't force myself through it. I mean, I was going to say, I think you reach an age where anyone under the age of 35 just looks like a vague pink blob. So I couldn't tell anybody apart. It's just this vague pink shape and another vague shape. I don't know. Whereas once people reach middle age, I can start to tell them apart now. It's a bit easier. But yeah, I mean, I don't mean, any criticism of the show for having young people relationship drama. I mean, of Black Sails, because obviously there are young people do exist. Some of them watch television, but that part of the show is not for me. I'm more interested in depressed middle-aged people who've ruined their lives and now have to face, the last years of their life in a ruined relationship. That's what I want to see more of that content. That cheers me up. I feel very alienated by young people being happy. I want to see old people being miserable. I feel seen.
It's the Shakespearean aspects of, fatal flaws and the complex humanity. We were talking about before we started recording about professors being treated as minor celebrities in the US. And one of those that I was obsessed with for a while was Harold Bloom. And I devoured Shakespeare's The Invention of the Human by Harold Bloom, and who's a professor at Harvard. And one of the things that I love the absolute most about Black Sails is that interpersonal drama and the kind of dark night of the soul that we get from Flint pretty much as a steady arc across all of the seasons. And I see very much of Miranda and James as that kind of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth dynamic that we're supposed to believe in season one before we understand, we pull back and understand everything that's going on historically with them. But that is the aspect. It's not the blowing up. It's not the ship battles and things like that, though I don't
like those bits. Yeah, I like those bits. I think they're well done. Yeah, I just think that's what makes it so surprising that the show puts so much effort into this really really, I mean, I'm not a Shakespearean person, so, you know, I'm probably not seeing exactly what you're seeing, but I think we are seeing the same things.
Mm-hmm.
In a way. We just kind of turn to different literary traditions to describe it. But it's really surprising to find that in the midst of it. And I just wish I'd listened to who was desperately trying to tell me that this is, you know, Paradise Lost in boats. Basically, yeah. I wish I'd listened, and I wasted years of my life not watching Black Sails, but I could have been watching it because of that. I think, you know, what really, really grabbed me was, yeah, that kind of midlife crisis, that failure, that sense of ruined life. But the dark, that, like you say, that dark night of the soul. The bit that I was ranting about was the bit in Paradise Lost where Satan has decided to fly to Earth to destroy God's new creation. Mm-hmm. And while he's in the void, hesitates for a moment and thinks, what am I doing? Could I apologize? I could apologize to God. I could go back to heaven. I could apologize to God, and all this could be undone. And it's that moment of I could apologize to England. I could seek a pardon. And then Satan goes, wait, no, I'm not sorry. I haven't done anything wrong here. I will never be sorry. How can I go back, apologize when I'm not actually sorry? God is still my enemy. And that's when he has this wonderful, so farewell hope, and with hope farewell fear. Farewell to good, all good to me is lost. Evil, be thou my good. And there's no turning back from there. I'll be mortified if I've misquoted that. That's going to be very embarrassing, because I feel like I've memorized that bit of Paradise Lost, because I love that bit. I love this moment of doubt, and then realizing that I'm not sorry. Actually, I'm right. I'm going to keep going, but there is no turning back. And it's that acceptance that I am a monster. I am everything that's been said about me. I am that thing, and I'm going to be that thing worse than ever now. But there's no sense of, oh, I'm not really that bad, or there's been a mistake. This is not a mistake. This is a deliberate choice now. I'm not just a victim of circumstance. And that's why that moment reappears in Frankenstein, where the creature has been mistreated and abused and misunderstood. But there's that turning point where, like Satan, the creature says, evil be thou my good. I'm not the helpless victim of circumstance. I am now your enemy for real. And I know that I'm damned, and I know that this is going to destroy me, but I can't be sorry, because you are my enemy. You have put me in this position, and now, England will apologize to me.
Yeah. So you had mentioned when we had talked previously, because we have endless conversations about Black Sails, about, just literary texts around it. And one of the things you mentioned is that you see more parallels with Black Sails and Jekyll and Hyde than with Black Sails and Treasure Island. And I do see those parallels as well, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Well, I think for me, and I know, other fans are going to get really angry with me saying this, for me, a big weakness of the show is I don't understand how that Long John Silver is going to become the Long John Silver in Treasure Island. Even by the end, I don't see it. I'm not convinced by him in the body of the show. But the really shocking thing was also watching, all the way through Black Sails. Well, how is this person going to become Billy Bones? How is Billy Bones going to become Billy Bones from Treasure Island? And in the final couple of episodes, you go, oh, that's how. Yeah. And for me, that is the Treasure Island prequel. Is not Long John Silver, is Billy Bones. That Black Sails functions as a prequel for Billy Bones much more effectively, I think, personally, than for Long John Silver. But I think the relationship between Treasure Island and Black Sails that really works for me is the sense that there is something wrong with Treasure Island. There is something about Treasure Island that doesn't hold together, that doesn't make sense. There is some injustice here. There is something unconvincing about these characters who are supposed to think are good, but actually are behaving quite badly. And why is everyone so traumatized? Why are all the pirates clearly, ruined with sort of PTSD and perpetrator trauma? This is one of my theories about Treasure Island that I'll one day try and get someone to explain to me, because I know people who specialize in Robert Louis Stevenson, and I don't, but why it's so kind of immersed in trauma. So I think it's really you can see Black Sails being a really effective prequel in trying to explain, well, if you have this instinctive feeling that Treasure Island doesn't quite make sense, here's why it doesn't make sense. It's because it's imperial propaganda. It's a lie. Yeah, I think with Jekyll and Hyde, I keep forgetting. How do I keep forgetting that Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island, is the same one who wrote Jekyll and Hyde? But I do keep forgetting it. I keep forgetting this is the same guy. So I teach, I've taught Jekyll and Hyde every year for many years until this year. And I think it looks like it has a lot more in common. It's a text like Frankenstein that everyone thinks they know, even if they haven't read it. And then when they actually read it, are really surprised that it's not quite what they've been led to expect. So I think you might imagine that in Jekyll and Hyde, that Jekyll is the false social facade for Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde is the real person inside him who's dark and evil and that. But whereas the text is really explicit that no, they're both real, but they're real in different ways, and that the difference is that one is socially acceptable and that one has been created by repression or something. Something like that vaguely. So I think that's what we see being worked through very clearly in Black Sails, in Flint's character, that difficulty of, well, what is the relationship between James McGraw and Captain Flint? Why might one conjure up this other self to do the terrible things that the socially acceptable self can't do? Was that darker self there all along? Which, I have a whole other opinion about that that's actually sort of separate from Jekyll and Hyde. So that's it. I think the relationship between, insofar as there's a relationship between Treasure Island and Black Sails, it is that sense that there is something wrong, that somebody is lying in Treasure Island. Yeah. And we have that, the beautiful monologue that Flint gives on Skeleton Island in the final episode, where he says, we will have been for nothing. All this will have been for nothing, defined by their histories. And then until nothing is left of us but the monsters and the stories they tell their children. Yes. And so much, I think, that sums up the entire perspective on Treasure Island that the show is bringing us, is that Treasure Island is the result, that Black Sails is the source material, and Treasure Island is the result of those voices being crushed. And yes.
And that's the major tragedy of the story is that's what we're left with. And one of the things that I wanted to mention about Jekyll and Hyde, because I have loved that story for so many years and was a fan of the horrible Frank Wildhorn musical. And one of the things that I loved that so many adaptations of that particular text get wrong is they create this monstrous Hyde. And one of the things I loved about the description of people's talking about Hyde in the text is that there was just something off. There was something not quite right. And to me, that's terrifying. And when you put it in a setting of this monstrous villain, that's terrifying. But when you put it in society as a whole, it's how people get railroaded and forgotten and shoved into special needs classrooms and hidden away from, my son is autistic. And when we were living in Japan, they did not know how to deal with his autism. It's not that there aren't children or adults on the spectrum. It's just that those people are shoved into the shadows in their society. And a lot of that I see reflected in James's character, where there are aspects that don't fit in society, that aren't polite, that are things that we are not supposed to be. They aren't pretty, and he is shoved into the margins and decides to fight back about it. And that's one of the things that I've always appreciated, both about Black Sails and about Jekyll and Hyde.
Well, this is, you know, I think you and I have talked about, I have a particular neurodivergent interpretation of Flint that is perhaps at odds with, I think, quite a lot of fans and quite a lot of what the show is telling us. That the show tells us two conflicting things about the relationship between these two aspects of him. So we're told initially by Flint, and even throughout season 2 by Flint, that James is the real person and Flint is this persona that he created who would be able to do the terrible things that James McGraw can't do and doesn't want to do. And Silver at the end insists that he unmakes this creature, this monstrous creature, and underneath this thing created by trauma is the real James McGraw. But I don't have any kind of issues with that reading. I just don't think it's the most interesting reading, or it's not the reading that interests me. I'm interested in, there is a conflicting version of that story, even in the show itself, where in season 3, Ghost Miranda says that Flint was the part of you that was always there, but wouldn't allow it to see the light of day. And then I spoke and it stepped forward into the light. And whether Flint is actually visiting Miranda in the underworld and she's telling him that, I assume that she has special knowledge as a ghost in that way, or whether it's the way that his own mind is explaining it to himself through Miranda, because the way he encounters his own emotions is usually through literary or dreamlike sequences, not directly and certainly not in the moment. I think it speaks to aspects of the darker aspects of late diagnosed autistic experience, where you may have a really long time of feeling that there is something wrong about you and there's something about you that other people don't like. And if you can't identify what that thing is, then there just must be something bad inside you. And I think this representation of Flint, it's so explicit. It's so explicit in his experience, that conversation he has with Hennessy, where this man who he looks to as his father, very naively perhaps, thinks of this man as a father figure, saying there is something dark and terrible inside you. What a thing to say! It feels like being punched. Watching it, I felt like a physical blow at that moment. And there's a bit much earlier on. Oh, maybe it's not earlier on. Yeah, but in season 2, where Silver first realizes that Flint actually experiences things like remorse and self-loathing, which Silver apparently does not.
Yeah.
And says it must be awful being you, and Flint looks like he's been slapped.
Yeah.
And it's really, really upsetting. So yeah, I'm always pro monster. When I'm reading Jekyll and Hyde, I'm really struck by how awful the good guys are. I'm not saying that Mr. Hyde is innocent, but they're all really terrible people, and they admit to, the minute I saw him, I wanted to strangle him. What's wrong with you? You should be looking at yourself, not Mr. Hyde. You all need to take a long look at yourself if that's how you react to people who just seem off to you, vaguely. So yeah, I get really emotional about stuff like that. I get really emotional about, in Captain America, the Winter Soldier. Why did they get rid of the Winter Soldier and not Bucky? Because Bucky was very annoying, I thought. He did not shut up. I much preferred the Winter Soldier. So yeah, by the end of Black Sails, when Silver says, oh, it's okay, I basically cured what was wrong with this guy and I got rid of the weird bit and we were left with the human James McGraw, I was really upset because I like Flint so much better than James McGraw. I found James McGraw really creepy. Oh, here we go. Here's my theory, right? So this was my kind of reverse thing. But this is it. So, where people say, obviously, Flint is this kind of facade that he's created to perform terrible crimes for him. James McGraw's the real person. I went back and watched it. I thought, James McGraw is a mask. He's kind of, to me, I find him creepy, a little bit Patrick Bateman, a little bit kind of plasticky. He walks like a human. He has human mannerisms and a human tone of voice that's really off-putting. He has human facial expressions. I don't like it at all. not a fan. And there are those moments when you rewatch it after Miranda has told us in season 3 that Flint was always inside him. There are those moments where we glimpse Flint emerging in those flashbacks before the big trauma event. He was already there. He was that inner darkness, as it's called. And I think we've got to have a lot of conversations about what darkness actually is in Black Sails and what it isn't. And that moment where James McGraw goes to the Hamiltons' house and finds out that Thomas has been taken to Bedlam, and he hugs Miranda, and we see his face over her shoulder, and his expression changes, and I think he has his little twitch, and his voice changes, and suddenly, like, oh, there's Flint. Oh, it's such a relief, I think. Yeah. We've got rid of that plastic mask, James McGraw, and we're seeing Flint underneath. And I think, I don't dispute people having their interpretations by all means. It makes the world far more interesting that we all have very different interpretations, but I think people interpret James as the one who is in love. Flint doesn't love. Flint is this monster. I think it's Flint that falls in love. I think it's Flint that has that complex emotional life that, okay, he may not always identify what he's feeling in the moment until 5 episodes later, and then he's willing to talk about it. But, yeah, I think he's the one who loves and is passionate and has ideals about things, whereas James McGraw was this very conventional professional mask. Yeah, and I don't like him. That's it.
And you know what? And you do see far more complexity, especially when Flint is introduced to the Maroon colony.
Yes.
And his interactions with the Maroon Queen and with Maudie. And there is so much more genuine understanding in terms of what they are all facing as a community together. Whereas those moments in season 2 during the flashbacks when we're getting him finally standing up and siding with Thomas, you never get a sense that he believes what he's saying. He stands up because he is defending Thomas, but up until that dinner, he has been fully against everything that Thomas has stood for in terms of those ideas.
I kind of agree with you, but I kind of think I saw it a little bit differently, that the moment when he stands up at the dinner party, where James stands up at the dinner party, the way his voice is shaking, and I think that's Flint. I don't think that's James. I think that's Flint. And what I love about his interactions with the Maroons, that at no point has he really, whether as James or Flint, had anything useful to say about the slave trade or those issues of, white supremacy and injustice, and doesn't particularly at the time. He's only interested in the liberation of enslaved people insofar as he's just clicked that there's an issue here with labor politics that he can use. And I don't mean it in a really, really cynical way, but I actually appreciate that they've got the measure of his character, that he's not a white savior. No, I think it's really honest. I think he has a good sort of personal and professional relationship with Maddie and with the Maroons, and a lot of genuine respect on a personal level. But at no point is this about a white man realizing racism is bad and then everything is solved. Yeah. It's not. And then we're seeing a lot more of the Maroons' perspective of, well, this is an extremely dangerous person, but they have certain skills. How do we make use of this white man who is willing to be an ally to a point? But I mean, it's not something I kind of want to talk about too much because it's not my area of expertise. And I think people who study race and the Atlantic world would have a much better viewpoint on it than me. But all I can say is, I did appreciate that this show wasn't dominated by what will solve racism is a white man realizing racism is bad.
He's not focusing on saving anyone. It's here is a group of people who can help me destroy everything.
Yeah, that's it. I think it's what I find weirdly convincing. What I really, really like about Flint's characterization is it's so easy to just throw in totally anachronistic, oh, and look, this guy respects women and he's not racist. One of the things that I really appreciate about Flint's characterization is the way he's, on a personal level, not racist or sexist, but is part of those political structures. But it's not kind of presented in a really over the top anachronistic way that, oh, hey, look at this man respecting women. It's like you can appreciate Flint respecting women because he's a really weird guy.
Mm-hmm.
Who's not, the reasons he's not immersed in misogyny are because he's not really living in the same reality as other people. It's not because he's a better person than anyone else necessarily, or because, hey, we live in a magical world where racism and sexism has been solved. It's that, no, he's just too weird to care about those things. Disrespecting women does not help him achieve his goals. So why would he disrespect women? I think again, that sort of neurodivergent reading of Flint as the unmasked version of whatever this person is. So I'm really interested in what the darkness is in Black Sails. And I think there's an interesting evolution in what the darkness is. And in those flashbacks, when Hennessy is referring to this darkness, this capacity for violence that he cannot name or identify, and neither can James, I think carries on for quite a way through. So one of my favourite monologues actually is not the one at the very end, but the conversation that Flint has with Silver in season 3 about when Silver has had Dobbs beaten. And Flint says, I know what you're doing. You heard a voice. And he talks about this thing within you, this voice within you that will move you to do whatever is necessary for it to be gratified, this appetite for violence, this darkness that wants to be birthed into the world. And Flint's saying, as long as you're aware of it, you can use it. But if you're not aware of it, then it will devour you without you realizing it was there. And I'm really unsure what that thing is. I think it's meant to be an appetite for violence, but I think that's all turned on its head in that final monologue. Where he's saying in the darkness is discovery, that, the famous monologue that everybody quotes, because the point is, at that final point, we don't know what the darkness actually is. And the whole point is, maybe we've been lied to about the nature of the darkness all along. That he's talking about this in the context of one day people will say we were monsters. And it made me think, because of that whole couple of episodes, the final couple of episodes have so many resonances with Conrad's Heart of Darkness about this journey into the jungle, in which the jungle and the African people are used as like a metaphor for the darkness that dwells within the European, rather than being allowed to be people in their own right. And there's lots of, academic criticism of that already. So I think Black Sails, it feels like it might be playing with that, because you've got that pursuit of Flint into the jungle. Flint has that kind of curt kind of character who has gone over to the other side, but is arguing, instead of arguing that, yes, I've gone over to the dark side, that you don't know what the darkness is. You only know the Empire has told you that the colonized and enslaved people are some kind of primitive darkness. Have you actually talked to them? Have you actually bothered to consider the personhood of the darkness that you treat as if it was just this symbolic mass of horror? There may actually be people there, and we don't know, because all we're doing is setting fire to them and destroying everything. So I think it's a really interesting piece for somebody who's far more of an expert in colonial and post-colonial criticism than I am. I would really like to see an analysis of that, how it relates to the ways in which darkness has been used in colonial literature. Because, I think it's being turned on its head. And I'm interested in it, again, from a kind of neurodivergent perspective, that what's being described here is this defect, this inhumanity, this flaw that Flint himself fears and hates about himself, and thinks, but I could use it, I can make it useful to other people. And it's like where you read neoliberal, watered down versions of neurodiversity saying, oh, autistic people can be really useful in the workplace. I mean, they're still really awful, but they can be used for business.
Yeah.
And I feel like, that's something that Flint lives with his whole life, is that it makes him a good officer. This terrible dark thing within him, Hennessy says, okay, but it does make you useful as a weapon of colonial violence, this terrible thing within you. And in that final monologue, we're getting this that, well, we don't know what that darkness was. We've just assumed that it was this evil force that could be turned to some kind of purpose, but we've never actually bothered to speak to it on its own terms. So yeah, I think you could do a post-colonial, near-colonial reading or a neurodivergent reading of that. But I think, again, that's where it calls back to that romantic satanic tradition of, you don't know what Satan is until you actually talk to him.
Yeah.
You don't know what the monster is. You don't know what Frankenstein's creature is until you actually talk to him. You just assume that he is this force of destruction and horror. But also, I think the thing that really, really compels me about Flint's storyline, I think you've touched on it as well, is what does it feel like to be monstrous? What does it feel like to be frightened of that thing in yourself? I think that's so vivid in Black Sails. Not just what does it look like to see a monstrous person who might not be as bad as you thought, but what does it feel like when we have those dream sequences in season 3 inside this strange soundscape, strange, muted world that's inside Flint, that's very frightening and sad in there. I really like that aspect of it, because I think not that I don't think there's enough horror in the world, but I'm always a big fan of what does it feel like to be the monster.
Yeah, I find the psychological aspects of horror, when viewed from the perspective of the inciter of violence, or the person who is the outcast. One of the things that I love about the portrayal of Flint's darkness and his trauma in regards to his visions of Miranda are that he is obviously deeply disturbed by them. This is not a reality that he sits in, and because of who he is, that is normal and okay to him. He's daily traumatized by it. Like he's not comfortable with it. It's not like there are certain types of people, and going back to Jane Eyre, there's good blood and bad blood. And there aren't groups of people who are villains. There aren't groups of people who are righteous. There aren't groups of people who that we all experience our own worlds and our own trauma. And regardless of, whether society paints us as righteous or villains, we're all traumatized by ourselves, by the world around us, and our actions are the thing that define us, not our internal perspectives in terms of societal acceptance. The very fact that Flint is so obviously disturbed by his own violence and by his own trauma and his own past, that Silver does not understand, because when he says guilt also goes away if you let it, he's not things roll off him and they don't stick. And
I think that the issue of introducing Ned Lowe at the beginning of season 2, I don't know whether it fits or whether it's a weird aberration, because the show seems to be presenting us there with a type of person who does not experience remorse and human emotion. So it seems like this weird, possibly a weird contradiction. And I don't know whether it's something that's helpful in understanding how Flint is different from that, because I think that's obviously what it's there for, is to show that Flint is not like Ned Lowe. But I always think there's something slightly troubling about stating there is a kind of person who does not experience remorse. I mean, if you read things like the psychopath checklist and the way things talk about psychopaths, that really, because it's written as if this was some kind of inhuman species. I was thinking, but they are human. what is this implication that there is a type of person who is not like other types of people? I always find that slightly dubious, slightly worrying, because it has such dangerous potential to assume there is a type of person who is essentially not a person, who looks human but is not human. I find really worrying. But yeah, it fulfills a certain kind of function with differentiating Flint from that. And it's obviously, but that again, that's why I get so interested in the romantic satanic tradition for Flint, because Flint makes absolute sense in that context, that it is someone who is thoroughly accepted that they are damned. And therefore, particularly in season 3, we see Flint who has just let go of he hasn't let go of remorse, but has accepted that he is a monster. And however sickening and upsetting it is to him, and we see him crying on the floor, he's just surrendered himself to this darkness that wants to be born into the world. He's just let go of himself and allowed himself to be the conduit for this terrible violence, whether it comes from within him or whether it's a thing that exists in the world, because this isn't a real reality. It's a slightly gothic reality that Flint inhabits. There may be a dark force, which, as I say, we don't really know what that force is, but something is compelling him. He's compelled to do these terrible things, and he's not in control of that compulsion, I think, in season 3. But yeah, that's very different from Ned Lowe, who feels no conflict with whatever that dark thing is. He has no conflict, no resistance whatsoever.
Yeah, and in terms of like John Ronson, I'm not sure what his background is in psychology, but I did read the Psychopath Checklist, and it's very interesting. It talks about people like zoo animals almost.
Yeah.
Which it's fascinating, but just because it's fascinating doesn't mean it's correct. And one of the things that I love about Black Sails is the emotional complexity and all of the shades of gray. There's no like black or white, with the exception of Ned Lowe. Ned Lowe is kind of the anomaly in the majority of that.
He does feel like an anomaly, and that's my only kind of query about, well, what's he doing here? Because he is a real aberration perhaps in the entire show. So while I'm saying, he obviously is fulfilling a function to explain how Flint is different from that, why is there this one person who is a complete aberration? Because even the Marine Captain Beringer, towards the end, there's a suggestion that he is a damaged person, that he's not somebody who's utterly without humanity, that something has happened here to make him so. But so I don't know what to make of Ned Lowe at all. But also, I suppose in one sense, he is fitting in with the show, where his quartermaster's saying, but he's not a coward or a liar. He is what he says he is. And as Ned Lowe says himself, I'm not dishonest about what I am, which I suppose in a sense fits with the show, that he's somebody who has, who's gifted with self-awareness, whereas plenty of other characters have no self-awareness.
Yeah. One idea that I have about, why they chose to use him as a character in the beginning of season 2, right at the lead up to the kind of the unscrolling of Flint's backstory.
Yeah.
Is they're introducing a very conventional villain that the audience, will immediately latch onto as a big bad. And then over the course of a very brief span of episodes, he's quickly dispersed of, and it's like, no, this isn't the story we're telling. This is not the enemy. The enemy is the system. The enemy is everything that makes up conventional society and rules about conduct and thought and class and all of that. It's all of the structure in society that says that anyone who is other is a monster. And I think that may be, and I'm not sure, but that's just one of my theories about why he was given that little tiny story arc.
That makes sense. That totally makes sense, because it does feel like, with say, Deadwood, which obviously has a really close relationship with Black Sails, or Black Sails has a close relationship with Deadwood, where you'd have someone who you think is the bad guy, and then the next season they bring in someone worse, and then the next season they bring in someone even worse. So suddenly the guy who was the bad guy, you're now actually kind of rooting for him because he's not as bad as this new bad guy. But yeah, I can totally see that. It makes total sense that you think that villainy is a bad individual, and then you find out the bad individual is not the point. There's actually the real danger here is these much bigger systems, and the real danger. This is why I was saying I don't hate Woodes Rogers that much. If I have to hate an individual, it's Peter Ash for being cowardly and sneaky and weak.
Yes.
And not even good at doing the thing that he's doing. At least Woodes Rogers is doing the thing that he was sent to do. And my absolute hate for the whole thing is Richard Guthrie.
Yes.
It's the wig on top of hair, the hat on top of wig on top of hair situation is really offensive to me. I don't like it. But yeah, it's the sneaky, cowardly. His vices are not grand satanic vices. They're the vices of a weak, cowardly man. Flint's flaws tend to be big, heroic flaws, not being a bad father or being creepy to women, which I think is really, really important. I think we've talked about before, you and I, how we have Flint is a monster, and I don't have any qualms about that, but that's because I'm always on the monster side. So to me, it's not a bad thing. But at least he's not sexually harassing his employees. He's not disrespecting women. He's not creepy in any kind of way like that. That's the stuff that would really put me off if I was watching something. And I think, you said are there certain kinds of fanfics you don't want to read, and I said to you there's a particular thing I do not want to read, which is fics where Flint has a sexual relationship with Maddie. And it's not just because of the age gap. It's like, I don't want to think of Flint as this guy who slides up to this young woman whose father has just died and thinks, oh, hey, baby, what's wrong? That kind of, here's my opportunity to seduce this woman. He would never do that. He would never try and seduce a young girl whose father's just died. That would be out of order.
It's so predatory. Yes,
that's like
absolutely.
There's loads of other terrible things he'd do. He'd do murder, but he's not going to creep on a young woman whose father's just died. Same with Eleanor. No, it's not going to happen.
No. Yeah. One of the dynamics that I love in the show has always been the paternal dynamic between Flint and Eleanor. And because of that aspect, because I know that Flint cares about her, because she was 10 years old, I think 10. She was very young when he first arrived in Nassau. And because I see that he has an affection for her, it is kind of a transitory affection in terms of like, I project myself into seeing Eleanor the way that Flint sees Eleanor. And I also have a lot of trauma from my family background, and I understand Eleanor, and I would not make the same choices that Eleanor does, but I understand why she makes those choices, and we all have a moment where you can either make the correct choice or the incorrect choice. And there are sometimes ways to go back and fix it, but a lot of times there are not. And she is very protective of herself and her interests, but there are a lot of male characters that exhibit the same self-preservation, and a lot of the things that that the fandom loves about John Silver, they hate about Eleanor. And
I don't love them about John Silver, and I'm more forgiving of Eleanor in that sense. I think the point where I'm not feel more harshly towards Eleanor, but feel that her fate is inevitable, is that she makes a decision to align herself with the forces of oppression, with the delusion that, because I'm an upper class or I'm a posh white woman, I won't become the victim of these forces, like those women of colour over there who we see being abused. I will be protected and special. And she has obviously the horrible, horrible realization that she was not protected, that in the eyes of this patriarchal, white supremacist imperial culture, she is a thing to be destroyed and violated, with very little more care than the women of colour that she's willing to see sacrificed so that she can be safe. But I think the point where, and it's not even good moral judgment on Flint's part that he has so much sympathy for Eleanor. I think it's what I appreciate about Flint's relationship with Eleanor is that they're both very unlikable people to everyone around them. And they have that compassion for each other as people who nobody else likes on a purely emotional level, because they're enemies by the end. They're enemies.
Yeah.
But they still treat each other with compassion on a personal level because they know what it's like to be hated, and they pity each other to an extent. And I really love that bit in season 1 where Flint is drunk in Eleanor's room, and for a moment you think like they're going to kiss, and then he kisses her on the forehead. It's kind of like she realizes, oh right, he's, that's not where it's going. And after that she becomes really protective of him, and she's picking fights with Miranda very, very unwisely. But I really like that element of their relationship, that even when they diverge politically, they still pity each other. And that there's room for that in the midst of everything else.
And when we look at season 4, where Flint surrenders himself as collateral, and he's in the dungeon in the fort, you can see this just weight of disappointment in his whole conversation when he mentions Woodes Rogers. Is he really any better than any of us? And you see that he still has this care for her, but this just deep disappointment that is very paternal.
I didn't see that. I found it very neutral.
I don't know. I just, in my perspective, watching that scene, I see that he had such high hopes for her, and that he has seen everything that she has sacrificed of herself personally, because you see physically how different Eleanor is.
Yes, that's true.
In season 4 versus season 1, and this spirit in her that has died a little bit, to the point where when Woodes Rogers is having his manifestation of her ghost, it is her sitting there and knitting, which is not her at all. And it's just all of her that has been swallowed up by her need to conform to survive in that situation. And it's very sad. And I think he's viewing her for really the first time at length, having a moment with her, because since she has come back, he has been at war with Woodes Rogers. He hasn't had any time to actually spend with her, that he's actually sitting and realizing how much of the old Eleanor is gone. And I think there's this sadness and disappointment that is there in that scene.
I didn't feel it at all, because I think I only rewatched it yesterday, that scene. I think I saw that his weird neutrality was what I read in that scene. And I think that's what I find so compelling about his characterization, and particularly when I was talking about a neurodivergent reading, how monotropic Flint is. And I'm sure there's obviously an influence there from Ahab in Moby Dick, but this kind of, and I think Toby Seamus has in an interview mentioned that monomania. That so long as something is in Flint's very, very narrow tunnel of attention, he's obsessed with it and aware of it and insightful about it. But if it's outside of that tunnel, he's completely indifferent. And I'm still unsure, at the beginning when he says, "Who's Billy?" Is he joking, or is he genuinely just forgotten who Billy is?
I don't think he's joking. I think it's plays very funny on screen, but I think it's more a statement of him and how he does view his crew as shapes. bodies in the employ of his personal vendetta.
Yeah,
And
but I like that about him, because that's what I think, where I was rambling so much before about his gender politics and his racial politics, what very little of it that there is, and I appreciate how little of it there is, comes from his total monomania of that being racist to the people of color who he's working with would not serve, is irrelevant to his purpose. So why would he do it? Why would he be misogynistic? Because it's not relevant to anything that he's doing. It's not because he's this fabulous man who is miraculously enlightened in all these ways. I think it's genuinely, those things are just so irrelevant to him. He seems to get on much better with women because women are working on the same project that he's working on. He seems to really hate most men because most men are obstructing, or at best just distracting from the project he's working on. It's not that he's this fabulously feminist. That's what I'm trying to say. He's not that he's this fabulous kind of anachronistic feminist existing in the 18th century. It's literally that men are really, really annoying. The women who he encounters are usually working on some kind of social project. So he's able to relate to them and have a conversation with them. Yeah, that's what I was rambling about before. That's what I was trying to say. And I really appreciate that they haven't tried to make him this white savior who has these wonderful revelations about slavery being wrong, as if that is what the liberation of enslaved people was about. Because really, there was so much work done by the enslaved people themselves and by the Maroons. It's not about, oh, thank goodness a white man has realized racism is bad, now everybody's saved. That in Black Sails, that happens kind of coincidentally, because it happens to fall within Flint's monomania.
exactly.
And within the narrow tunnel of his monomania, there isn't room for racism on the level of personal bigotry, at least. Because he admits that, he's been trading slaves. He is a slave trader. But when that's no longer relevant to what he's trying to do, he doesn't give it up because he's realized it's wrong. He's realized that actually that action contradicts his project, and that's the only reason that he's now against the slave trade. And yeah, that's I really appreciate that. I don't know why, but I really appreciate that they haven't just magically parachuted in this miraculously enlightened man, even though I'm convinced part of Flint's problem is that he's a romantic Byronic guy living 100 years too early, that he would make sense in 100 years time, but unfortunately he's here in the early 18th century. But yeah, he's not this magical feminist. He's just this guy who, so long as a woman is doing the stuff that he's doing, is working on his group project with him, then she's the most wonderful person who's ever existed. But otherwise, nobody else exists outside of that.
Yeah.
They're all just vague shapes and noises in the background. And I really appreciate that. I enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah. One of the things that I think listening to you talk about that really kind of brought into focus the moment that he really connects with Maudie. One is that Silver has been taken out of perspective. So at the time, Silver was standing full flush in the spectrum of his vision Silver was his tool at that point of being an arm of manipulation. And there were many, many aspects that Silver could kind of shape the reality of his men in a way that he wasn't able to do. So Silver has been removed from his perspective at that point. And so if Flint is looking at everything through this constricted viewfinder, Maudie suddenly steps into that field of view. And when he kind of zeroes in on her, when she quotes Don Quixote back at him. And all of a sudden, she becomes very important to him because he realizes that they have a shared vision. But it wouldn't have happened until he's forced to shift focus because Silver is now gone.
But it's I think as well, we shouldn't downplay that Maddie has studied and had this conversation with her father about how should I communicate with these people. And in the case of Flint, this person who doesn't quite inhabit the same reality that we inhabit, doesn't run on the same operating system, And the answer is we will communicate through literary illusions. That when Flint talks about his emotions, it's usually through some kind of literary illusion. And I think when you were talking about Miranda and his distress about what's happened to Miranda, when I was thinking about those visions, I was thinking about how the visions he has of Miranda change from being very jarring and very confusing and nightmarish to these moments of real communion with the vision of Miranda. But they're very strange stylistically. They're not even direct conversations quite often. They quite often have each reciting a monologue that harmonizes with the other's monologue. Face-to-face conversation is not Flint's main way of communicating. He does his grand satanic speeches to the crowd. He's able to sway the legions of the damned. But on a one-to-one level, it's perhaps not his forte. And I think, you know, when you've had this conversation with one of your writers saying that he's really, really awkward on a personal level, which obviously I really, really enjoy about him. But what I find so interesting is that Maddie has studied how to have a conversation with Flint, which is quite often standing behind him or standing facing away. They're usually, you know, avoiding eye contact or standing out in each other's eye line, using literary illusions and things like that. But yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Actually, Silver needs to not be standing in front of Flint for him to be able to see anybody else, because he could only see one person at a time, which I have to say, that's something I really kind of identify with, because I can't remember the existence of more than one person at a time. I'm really face blind. So I felt that who's Billy? I felt that really strongly, because I sometimes don't even recognize family members. I'm completely in a blur as to human beings. So yeah, I appreciated that little detail there. But yeah, I think that's such interesting characterization. And I would love to see Black Sails get even more attention for neurodivergent readings, because I know it does have a big following and there's loads of fans who write from that perspective. But I think there's a lot actually going on there. And I'm also writing, I've written a chapter on disability in Black Sails, but for an edited collection, which is going through some process. So I can't really tell you much more about it because I don't know where it is in that process at the moment. But in the book I'm writing at the moment, the idea for the book became a book when I watched Black Sails and had a conversation with somebody about it. And it became really clear that it has a lot to say about asexuality, which it seems really ridiculous. So the book that I'm writing is about representations of asexuality in literature and television. And I'm not really interested in asexual identity or asexual characters. I'm interested in literature or television that resists compulsory sexuality. So I'm very influenced by, say, Sharonda J. Brown, who writes about Black asexual experience, which again is less focused on this identifying as an asexual person, but as this huge oppressive structure of compulsory sexuality. And one of the things I think Black Sails gets into almost by accident is the way it depicts sex and relationships, because it's so extremely, extremely queer. It doesn't just have, oh, here are some lesbians, here is a bisexual person, here's a gay person. We have ticked some boxes. We have ticked, you know, the LGBT boxes. Now we have done representation. It's much more immersed in how do different social structures allow different types of relationships. If you live in pirate world where there are no laws, where anything goes, what becomes the real form of intimacy? And we find that the real forms of intimacy in Black Sails that I find so fascinating are quite often non-sexual relationships, usually polycules that include some people who are in a sexual relationship and some people who are not in a sexual relationship, either with anyone in the polycule or with one person, not another, and that those are given the greatest weight. And I think, you know, with Flint and Silver, you get this asexual marriage where you can read it as, oh, they really want to be a gay couple, but there are obstacles. Or you could read it as what we're seeing is that they are having an intensely erotic relationship, an intensely intimate relationship in which sex is just not necessary. It's just not part of it. And it's, you know, also involves Maddie as part of that relationship. And, you know, I think there's a lot to say about the way Black Sails engages with queer history. And what I really appreciate about it, one of the things that really stunned me about Black Sails, in addition to those literary elements and its involvement with romantic Satanism, and as I saw it, was it seems to be very informed by certain kind of constructionist idea of queer history, which is that 20th century homosexuality is not the pinnacle of queer experience that has always existed through all time of space. Only people were too ignorant to realize that they were all actually white, Western, modern homosexuals. But if they'd known that it existed, they would have known that that's what they were. And Black Sails seems to be really, I'm convinced that somebody there has either read Foucault or Alan Bray's Homosexuality in Renaissance England, which talks about these relationship structures where you have male-male sexuality that was not an identity, it was just a thing that men did, that any man could do if he was drunk enough, or that men could fall in love, but that wasn't an identity. And I think it's really, really visible in Flint's characterization. I think that's what's happening. I think somebody has read that particular strand of queer history and has committed absolutely to a historical queer experience where the sex of your partner is not definitive of your sexual identity, and where it's not an identity at all. It's a thing that happened. He fell in love with a man. That is a thing that people do. It was illegal to perform certain sex acts. They did that. It was very often ignored unless there was a political motive to prosecute, which Miranda is really explicit about. So Flint's saying, oh, this is ridiculous, I'm not going to be hanged for this. And Miranda's going, when there's a political motive, it will be, which makes me think, oh, somebody has definitely read Alan Bray, because that's really very much a point, that it was a thing that was common between masters and servants, or if not common, it fitted within the shape of patriarchy and might go unremarked. And I think Alan Bray gives evidence of plenty of cases where it was considered unremarkable until there was a political motive to drag it into the light. Not that it was approved of or even tolerated, just that it, so long as these relationships did not disturb patriarchal norms, they could be ignored. That's what I really appreciate in Black Sails, that somebody has really committed to that and they've stuck with it. So there is no particular reason to think that when Flint has the second most depressing sex scene of all time ever on screen with Miranda, that it's because, oh, he's really gay, he would really rather be with a man. It's like there's a lot of other things that could be happening right now to do with what does intimacy mean for these two different characters, that for Miranda, sex could create intimacy. Miranda seeks sex as a way of creating intimacy. For Flint, it's all about the group project. We never see him have sex with Thomas. We know that it must have happened, because why else would they be so scared of being prosecuted? But okay, I'm sure there are really trivial kind of production reasons why we don't see that sex scene. But I like to think it's because it's not actually important in his recollections, that for him, that relationship was all about the group project, as his relationship with Maddie is all about the group project. As his falling out with Silver is because Silver does not share the group project, and Silver's bitter look of absolute poisonous loathing when he sees Flint and Maddie look at each other and connect. Come on, he's not suspecting that Flint is sleeping with Maddie.
No.
It's because they are immersed in this group project, which is so much more intimate for them than sex would be. So yeah, I think that what happens between Anne and Max is perhaps a slightly different model of queer history, which is not an area that I particularly read about. I'm sure historians of lesbianism would have really interesting things to say about that. But I think, yeah, what's happening with Flint is this iron commitment to a particular way of talking about queer history, and I appreciate it. And that's why I get really sad when I see fans or even fan works imposing a 20th century homosexuality onto it, not because you're not allowed to read things the way you want to read it. It's more like, but you've been given this beautiful gift here, and you've just gone, oh yeah, that must be 20th century homosexuality. Like, no, but that's the most boring thing that could ever happen. Just appreciate how weird the early 18th century was. And there's a shift, according to Alan Bray, that happens around this time, actually, around sort of 1720-ish, where you start to see the prosecution and persecution of molly houses, that I think Bray argues is something recognisable as a kind of sexual identity. But that is also really explicitly not what Flint and Thomas are doing. They seem to be part of this earlier kind of Renaissance male-male love. Yeah, and I think it's so exciting to see it on screen. I haven't seen anything so committed to reimagining a historical queer experience since the film Tombstone from 1993, the Western, which I've no idea how historically accurate it is or isn't. That isn't the point. But it depicts a historical society on the frontier that has a very wide range of male-male intimacies, some of which look like homosexuality as we would know it, some of which are homoerotic, some of which are men in love who clearly love each other, or are each other's main partner in life, but it's not a sexual relationship. And it doesn't bother to explain or translate any of that. It's just, you just have to shrug it off and go, well, it's the 1880s frontier. It's none of your business, basically. So, yeah, I think I haven't seen anything so committed to a historical, really immersing itself in the otherness of history for a long time. That's what I find really thrilling about Black Sails.
Yeah. And historically, looking at the context of those type of relationships where it's very hard to define in terms of anything tangible other than the emotionality of the connection. Even you look biblically at David and Jonathan, the way that their relationship is described in scripture is very romantic. And I don't think there's any way to get around that idea that there was not some love that was based on eroticism between them. The way that it is written in scripture by people who would condemn any kind of homosexuality, there's just so much poetry around that relationship.
Well, see, I'm really unhelpful because I'm not a biblical scholar at all. But if I'm thinking of reading like the King James Bible from the early 17th century, that's the book that's the version of the Bible that I tell my students it must be that version. If you're going to quote the Bible, it's got to be that version because that's the version that has an influence on English literature. It wouldn't surprise me to see a Renaissance idea of male-male love coming through in that version, but I'm not a biblical scholar at all. But yeah, absolutely, I just think it's the most boring thing in the world to assume that 20th century models of sexual identity must have existed not only through all time, which I just find boring, but unfortunately across all cultures as well. I think it's a bad impulse. It's a bad impulse to see indigenous genders and say, oh, that is a version of my white Western gender identity. I think it's an impulse that, I'm white and Western myself, that I kind of try and fend off as far as possible, because I think it's a harmful impulse to try and read other people's experience through your own lens. And I know it's unavoidable and that's very much the point, but try and be aware of it at least. So it's harmless, I know, when I see Black Sails fans reading, oh, this is 20th century bisexual or whatever, but I think, but you're missing something. I feel like I'm getting more enjoyment out of it being weird and different than out of it being the same as something now. That probably makes me very hypocritical when I'm saying I'm seeing some kind of neurodivergent experience in those characters as well. But yeah.
And it's the policing of ideas that sometimes happens in the fandom that is very limiting in terms of being able to relate to it in the way that everybody brings their own thing to it, brings their own prism of experience to the story. And there is a lot of policing that happens. Like, Flint is gay. If you don't think that Flint is gay, then you are bad at media literacy. Or Flint is bisexual and you're bad at media literacy if you don't believe that Flint is gay. Or or exactly. That I think is very dangerous in how you approach a story like this.
I think as well, people might say that it's an academic thing to do, to say there is a correct reading of a thing. And what fandom does is it expands readings. But that's not my experience. My experience of academia in my classroom is I am begging all my individual students to create a new interpretation of a text. It could be so much weirder if you opened your mind up to the weirdness of it, though. But I think the thing that's sort of really telling to me, that's asking me to take that historical view, is actually the speech that Oglethorpe gives at the end or the beginning of the finale. This weird little monologue about how civilization requires some people to be outsiders, to define its own boundaries. The walls of civilization, the stability of civilization depends on expelling anything that is an aberration and using that expulsion to create the boundaries of what civilization is. Either they've been reading Foucault or Agamben Homo Sacer or something like that. It feels like somebody's read something really specific when they've written that. And I don't like the idea of treating a text like a puzzle and you're looking for clues to find out what the interpretation is. But that idea seems to me to be a kind of rounding off of the series of what it's telling us is everything you're seeing here is about creating outsiders and monsters and othering people to define the walls of normality and to define the walls of what civilization is. So it seems really clear to me that what we're seeing, for instance, in Flint sexuality is not an essential kind of self. It's a sexuality that's been created by other people's need to other. I think Oglethorpe's speech about civilization's need to outlaw and to other people, to define itself, that those people are not in some way extraneous to society, they're not rubbish to be discarded. They are actually necessary to creating the boundaries of society, so that there can be people outside looking in. It feels like quite a Marxist kind of view. It's an identifiable theoretical viewpoint. So yeah, I don't like to treat a text as if it's a puzzle to be solved, but I think that's got to be significant because it's such a strong identifiable theoretical position about what we're seeing here. And as you said, the bit where Flint is saying this story is going to be rewritten and it's going to be distorted for somebody else's purpose until we are just villains and monsters, is very much the point. So to me, the whole point is you won't understand what you're seeing here if you try and see it through the lens of whoever wrote the story afterwards, whoever the victors were. We're living in the ruins that Flint is dreading. We're living in the world in which we're living in the bad timeline where the Empire triumphed. And from that perspective, we cannot look back and understand. We all see only darkness when actually Flint is starting to see light and illumination and possibility. We are living in the bad timeline. I think one of the things you asked me about is a story true, a story untrue?
Yes.
I'd mentioned to you, I have this whole thing. So one of the things I want to write about, but it's going to be really difficult because I don't have a science fiction expertise at all, is that you could interpret Black Sails, at least the Flint and the Maroon storyline, as a kind of alternate history or nexus event. It's a moment where history was about to take another turn, and then Long John Silver steps in and shuts down that possibility, shuts down that nexus event, and diverts us into the bad timeline that we live in now, the timeline where the slave trade continued for another 100 years, where white supremacy became the ultimate organizing principle of Western society, and so on. So thanks for that, Long John Silver. But I really hate him. I really hate him for this. But yeah, so the idea that you could see it as this nexus event that was going one way or another, I think one of the things I want to look at is Halberstam's book, The Queer Art of Failure, actually talks about pirates as an example of an experiment in another kind of living, another kind of society that wasn't dominated by capitalism in quite the same way, that had different structures of relationships made possible, and that possibility, instead of opening out new ways of living in a new society, was shut down. So it's kind of shut down as a kind of nexus event. And to me, that is what Black Sails is fundamentally about, that it opens up for a brief moment this possible different timeline we could have gone down if Silver hadn't done the bad thing. And I kind of don't even care about what he did or didn't do to Flint, because Flint's fictional, that's the point. But that it's held up to us that history, the transatlantic slave trade could have been brought down. And this guy ensured its continuation because I love you and I want you to be alive. No. I hate him. He is the villain. He is the villain. Whatever he did or didn't do to Flint, he openly admits, yes, I made a treaty to continue the transatlantic slave trade because I love you. Unforgivable.
Yeah, I love people's handles on Tumblr. So I'm following someone on Tumblr who is doing a live blog of the series, watching it for the first time. Stork Muffin. And so I have been following this live blog, and one of the tags that they use consistently is anti-John Silver. So once they finish their watch, I've steered them away from the podcast in large part because it is riddled. Every single episode is riddled with spoilers.
Yes.
One of the things that they mentioned in terms of Woodes Rogers and why it is very hard to fully 100% view him as a villain is because he is very much the through the looking glass version of James McGraw.
And
Thomas, because he is accomplishing very much in the way that they even described their project of the re-civilization of Nassau. And introducing those pardons, he's doing that in the exact same way that they would have done it. But all of a sudden, we're on the other side of it, and we're understanding how that is horrible and how that is reinstituting society and reinstituting shame. But it's very fascinating. And I love watching new perspectives on the show because you get so saturated with your own opinion of it that watching people's reaction videos or watching people's live tweets or live blogs of their first viewing can be so enlightening. And I absolutely love that. And it's where I get some of my best ideas.
I'm not really on Tumblr, but one of my favorite things, I didn't put it in my list of like top 5 fics because it's not a fic, but there's a Tumblr of wrong Black Sails quotes. They insert captions from completely bizarre things like Mean Girls or 30 Rock. I'm a big fan of that. I have to say the Mean Girls version of Black Sails is really effective. But yeah, no, I think that point that if it wasn't Woodes Rogers, this is why I don't personally loathe him that much. If it wasn't him, they'd just send someone else. And they'd send someone else. And that's the whole point, is that people are interchangeable and disposable in that way. It's the empire is just going to keep coming and going to keep coming. And that Flint's idea was, if we do a deal with them, we might maintain some kind of control, but there's no way we can actually resist what's going to happen to us. And then he has that dramatic shift that I cannot deal with the empire. But he doesn't win. So I'm probably putting too much weight on Long John Silver as being the person who kind of sways it, because history perhaps was always going to revert back to the bad timeline that we live in now. But he certainly wanted to. He was willing to do it, even if it might have been someone else, if not him. And obviously it was because he's not real. But, you know, I mean, someone obviously did that. Someone obviously made the decision to continue the transatlantic slave trade. There were probably many points when someone could have stopped it. And, you know, that's how history is, isn't it? There were probably loads of these nexus points where it could have gone differently. So perhaps he's only one of many. But yeah, I can't forgive that he made himself the one who pulled the lever that turned us down that track there and then. And I don't care whether he killed Flint or not, because Flint's undead anyway. So he's a nebulous entity anyway, alive or dead. It probably doesn't make that much difference to him. He spends quite a lot of time in the afterlife, as far as we know anyway. He can just walk in and out of there, as far as we can tell. I'm not that bothered. Unless Silver cut off his head, pulled out his heart, burned him, scattered the ashes. He's probably not killable anyway, so it's probably fine. Whatever he did to Flint is probably fine. It's what he did to Maddie that I just feel like I'm not watching the same show as other people.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? When people read it romantic, they're like, we're not watching the same thing. And I shouldn't. This is me talking as a fan, not as an academic. As an academic, I'm really glad that everybody has different interpretations. But as a fan, I am enraged by that ending.
Yeah.
And I hate him.
So
and I'm glad that he's cursed. When Flint curses him, I'm glad that he's cursed. I'm glad that he's cursed to come back here and live an empty life because of what he did. Good. And I'm glad that he's stuck with a foul-mouthed parrot that will never die and will torment him forever. Good, he deserves it. So, yeah, I'm just spiteful towards him in that way.
So we've talked a lot about historical themes and sexuality and all of these in terms of interpretation of Black sails through the prism of history and through literary analysis. One of the things that I find really, really opens up Black sails to the world of fan fiction is that complexity that is there. It's a beautiful foundation and very strong structure on which to build a story. So what are your top 5 favorite fics?
They are, unsurprisingly, I think, almost all really historically focused. So top of my list here is Lily Bolero's Well Met, My Own True Love, which is written in the style of an early 18th century Newgate biography or criminal biography of the period. And I teach texts like that on one of my modules. So it's written immaculately. I mean, okay, I'm not an early 18th century scholar, so I can't say how precise it is, but it feels absolutely correct. And there's a huge slew of notes that go with it, explaining the research choices and things like that. So it's basically a period kind of pastiche biography of James McGraw, written as if, you know, it was a real criminal biography. It also reintroduced me to the folk song The Demon Lover, which Well Met, My Own True Love is the opening line of some versions of that. I think particularly the American version of it, which is such a great folk song as well, about a woman who's married, and then the lover who she was engaged to 7 years ago returns and takes her to sea, and he's actually a demon. Oh, sorry, that was a spoiler for the folk song, but it's a great folk song. So that, I love that fic. It's the level of commitment to the period language is really, really thrilling, but it's up through that veil of very difficult period language from a hostile narrator who sees this figure as a criminal. There are these unbearably touching moments of feeling where you glimpse Flint as we know him through this barrier of hostility. It's an incredibly clever fic. Number 2 on my list, these are not in real order, by the way, is Astronaut Squid's Amalgam, which I think I've mentioned to you. I'm obsessed with this fic.
Yes.
So as I was saying, I do not like James McGraw. I'm not a fan. I really like Flint. I think Flint should have survived. I think, you know, they killed off the wrong one of that conjunction there. How do I put that? Yeah, they killed off the wrong one there. So this is a story where it's set after canon, and Thomas goes home with James McGraw and then wakes up in the morning and Flint is in the kitchen as well. And there are two of them now, and they both really hate each other. And Flint is the most Flint that Flint could ever be, sulking and knitting socks in a menacing manner. I love it. It's unfinished, but I think people shouldn't let that put them off, because it kind of peters out after chapter 6, where the inevitable happens. This is only going to go one way, and then I think the story just goes, yeah, and then that happened, and that's really where that was going. So I kind of understand why it doesn't go any further. It's pretty much, there's not really much more to be said about that. I love it because I love this idea of them being two different people actually who live completely separate lives, but not separate lives, but really hate each other. I love it. There's so many others I could have chosen, and even by the same author. So Robot Boy, who wrote, I think, what's it called?
Butterscotch.
Yes, Butterscotch.
So, yeah.
I don't normally go for modern AUs, but I found the disability politics of that one really riveting, because I don't think Flint generally makes sense in the modern setting. I don't think that kind of person could exist in a modern setting. But with the disability politics, it really works. But my choice actually is another one by that author called Thick as Thieves, which takes seriously the suggestion in Black Sails that Flint is actually immortal. And in this case, so is Silver, because they did a bad thing that made them immortal. And it traces their bit by bit, in small segments, their existence over the next couple of centuries up into the present. And they keep recolliding with each other and living through different revolutions. The AIDS epidemic, as it was in the sort of 80s and 90s in America, and things like that. What was it like to watch all of this as people who cannot die, who are cursed with immortality? Yeah, I like it. I mean, should I say, spoiler, what the bad thing was that they did?
Yeah.
Cannibalism.
Wonderful.
I think Black Sails, the main thing that could improve Black Sails, if anyone cares about my opinion on what can make Black Sails better, is about 300% more cannibalism. I would have so much more cannibalism. I mean, the terror is great. People need to be eating each other a lot more in Black Sails. It's hinted at a couple of times, but it needs to have happened. And I'm not saying I need to see it graphically, but I think it would make sense to have more cannibalism in Black Sails. But yeah. So my next choice is, I'm cheating here, it's two, but they're connected to each other. I'm going to have this. The Journal of Lieutenant James McGraw by Beatrice H.B. and Garraways by Beatrice H.B. and Mellifluous. They're both connected to each other, I think, these stories. And they're both set in London in 1705, in the very beginnings of Thomas and James's relationship. And they are a really unpleasant characterization of James McGraw. So, I'm going to like that. He's a really nasty piece of work. He's really unpleasant, deeply repressed, and unkind to other people because of the way he's treating himself, the way he's denying so many aspects of his own character. But again, the period detail, I don't know or care how accurate it is. It feels absolutely real. Early 18th century London, it feels vividly real. And it deals with things like class, which I think, I'm not going to say if you're not English, you don't understand English class, but I think I probably see it and feel it a lot more strongly, perhaps, than, say, American fans do watching the show. Feeling like, what is it like? I can't imagine having a relationship with someone from a different social class than me. I just can't imagine it being feasible whatsoever. So I'm really on edge, and I'm really stressed when I'm watching Miranda thrusting herself upon James McGraw in his rooms. I'm really on edge, because how does he say no? How can he consent or not consent? Because this person has the power to ruin his life. So yeah, I like fics that actually dig into those drastic class differences. So the Journal of Lieutenant James McGraw and Garraways particularly are immersed in that, but you're starting to see in those quite hard views of James McGraw those moments where Flint breaks through, that much softer, much more romantic, passionate demon.
Yeah.
And my final choice here, unsurprisingly, dreaming pagan story, The Cup of Their Deserving, where Maddie stops Silver sending Flint to the penal colony just in time and realizes what a nasty piece of work Silver is, and Silver is properly punished for what he has done. And Maddie catches, I think Flint admits to her, when he comes out to Silver and Silver says, oh, so you basically kill everyone who loves you. You're such a toxic, poisonous person. You destroy everything you love. Maddie kind of catches on to that and said, that's actually really abusive. Did he really say that to you? And Flint's going, oh, yeah. And Maddie's going, that's terrible. Do you not realise that's really terrible? Yeah. So, yeah, I feel vindicated by that fic. It's great. I love it. I love it. It's very focused on the relationship between Maddie and Flint. Never goes into any kind of sexual or romantic relationship between them, which I'm not a fan of. It sticks with that idea that she is the queen and he will be her general and he will serve her that way. But yeah, I really like that fic actually captures on to what Silver actually does and how awful it is, which I think is often just skimmed over in a lot of fics. I like that one.
Oh, nice. Well, going back to the immortality fic that you mentioned, that reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Z. Danielewski, who wrote House of Leaves is his most famous work. But the follow-up novel that he put out to that, not related to that story, but it was just called Only Revolutions. And it was told from the perspective of these two teenagers traveling through time. And if you read the story from beginning to end, you get one of their perspective. And if you flip it over and read from the end to the beginning, you'd get a different story. And that kind of brought that story to mind, just hearing you talk about that. There was another fic that I just read because it was by Blue Trees, who was on episode 6. And she had just completed this story with Flint and Silver as immortals. And it brought that story to mind in the fact that there's no prose. It's entirely a conversation over hundreds of years.
Oh, I think I've read that recently.
Yeah, she just published it, and I was in tatters by the end of it. Like I sent a message of me trying to get myself together, like physically fully sobbing, but it was because of the structure and removing the prose from it. It gives you this really visceral sense of being in the perspective of both of them at once, and it was just an incredibly written piece.
Yeah, I think I've made a choice on this one because of my opinion on cannibalism in Black Sails.
Yes.
I like that one as well. And there's one. It's bizarre. It's a crossover with American Gods, and it's like a little snippet of American Gods where Wednesday and is it Shadow Moon? Oh, I've completely forgotten. But anyway, they visit Flint and Thomas, who are running a bookshop somewhere in New York or Boston or something. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in America. I don't know. And it talks about how are they immortal in the world of American Gods? How have they become immortal? And I can't quite remember the details of it, but it's a really interesting take on, which, again, Thick as Thieves is as well, on trying to explain how are they immortal, because one of the things I really enjoy about Black Sails, bizarrely, one of the things I enjoy about 30 Rock has the same running gag of there is a character who seems to be immortal and we refuse to ever explain how or why this has happened. It reminds me a little bit of Dracula the novel which doesn't really explain how or why Dracula's immortal. It seems to be just because he felt like it. And this is what you find in Treasure Island when the pirates are terrified that Flint might come back. It's just because, well, he's the kind of person who would. He's just like that. There's no kind of, there's no sort of attempt at world building, or except that Silver says, well, he probably wouldn't walk around in daytime. But other than that, there's no kind of technology or vampire virus or anything by this. It's just that Flint might just decide to be immortal. So now he is immortal. So I enjoy those kind of fics that dig into, well, what is the mechanism here, as much as what I really love about Black Sails is we're not going to explain a mechanism. Maybe there was human sacrifice involved. Maybe he's baptized in the blood of infants. He neither confirms nor denies that has happened, interestingly. He just kind of smiles and maybe it did happen. But he does seem to be unkillable, and I love that for him. But I also hate that for him because I feel like he really wants to die.
Yeah, I think he is. I think he has decided that it's inevitable, and he goes through all of season 4 like he is already gone. Like he seems to be relating to Maudie and Silver throughout at least the back half of season 4, as if he is saying goodbye and bequeathing this world, this vision to them.
Well, this is the thing that I was obsessed about, which I think I mentioned about my MA dissertation, which is I'm obsessed with characters who should not be alive, and how, not just how destructive they are because they should not still be alive, but what it feels like to be alive when you think you're actually dead. So Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights is a sort of weird example where you could argue that he died when Kathy died, and everything that happens afterwards is this monster going through the throes of an existence that should not be. The child that he produces dies because this is the child of a dead man. And I think Flint is the same species as Heathcliff and the little girl in the ring. I think, you know, if there had to be a species thing, I think they're probably saying at some point, maybe what's happened with Flint is someone put him down a well at some point. But certainly Billy Bones in Treasure Island experiences him like the little girl from the ring. So if you see the treasure map, you immediately get a phone call that says 7 days. And then you're going to be hunted down by the ghost of Flint, who's going to give you these horrible hallucinations and come crawling out. If you don't have a TV, I don't know what he's going to come crawling out of, but he's going to come crawling out of something anyway. So I think, there's that similar undeadness about Flint, but because of the particular literary tradition that I think the characterization is calling back to, it's less immersed in how horrible he is than how horrible it is to be the creature that cannot die, that wants to die but can't.
Yeah, I love any time I have the chance to reference The Ring, because that tends to be very much a mark of my age when I'm relating to my baristas. When I'm training a new barista and I'm going over expiration dates, and so like, how long does the milk get once we open it? I was like, 7 days. And when they look at me like I've got 2 heads, I'm like, oh, that's right, I'm really old.
I was terrified. I was more terrified by the remake. But yeah, I think when I watched the Japanese original, it turned out there was an explanation, and that somebody got knocked up by water goblins. I was instantly not frightened anymore because I thought, well, there's a really easy solution to that, which is to not get knocked up by water goblins. You could really easily not do that. So that kind of took the edge off me. But we don't know how Flint has been produced. Did he have a birth mother? Did someone find an egg on the beach? He may have had a father. He definitely had a grandfather. Do you know what my other horrible theory is? It's not a theory, but it's what I like to think happened. That his grandfather's story about the Mr. Flint who climbed up out of the water and then disappeared back into the water. I think it might be our Flint because he's fictional. He doesn't exist in our reality. He might be able to move through time as well. I think Silver knows he's fictional, but the fact that Silver says, I reached back through time to the point before Flint became Flint and I remade him or unmade him, that Silver is able to manipulate Flint's existence as if he was a fictional character. You can either take that as Silver being creative in his description, but I think it's more fun to take it that they actually are fictional. They are literary. They're not just fictional characters thrown in there. They are identifiable literary characters who we know are fictional. And there is a kind of meta-fic written by Robert Louis Stevenson himself, in which Long John Silver talks about being a fictional character and how he's Robert Louis Stevenson's favourite. And I don't think I'm the villain of this story. Or if I am the villain, I'm the most interesting person. You can tell that the writer likes me best. So Silver semi-canonically knows that he is totally fictional. So I like the idea that he might actually really be rewriting Flint, even though I think he made the wrong creative choice there. I think that Flint was the better character. Where are they going with all that?
Just talking about characters being able to erase each other and rewrite their own narratives.
I really like that idea, that Silver might have rewritten Flint, even though I do not like the rewrite that he does. But yeah, the idea that Flint could just decide to write himself immortal, so he is immortal now. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Alex. It's been just an absolute pleasure. I've been looking forward to our discussion for quite some time. We've had to reschedule because of my horrible health. But I'm so glad that we were able to sit down. This has been an absolute pleasure.
I thank you so much. I reached out to you because I was absolutely desperate to yell about Black Sails to somebody because hardly anybody's seen it. But apparently it's coming on Netflix in the US, so loads of other people are going to be seeing it. So we're going to have loads of other people to yell at as well soon. So again, I probably need to remove myself from social media to avoid the temptation to get into arguments with people that are unproductive and not appropriate. So yeah.
I do hope that we have a little bit of a Black Sails renaissance in terms of big idea people and people who are going to view it through a more literary perspective might be able to see the show for the first time and hopefully influence the way we tell stories in the future, because I think there's not enough of it. And hey, who knows?
I'm really hoping for an opportunity to wear the pirate coat that I made. So I hope that it becomes popular again. And I hope that the Pirate Festival returns to near where I live. And I can wear it, because I've worn it at work a couple of times when I was teaching 18th century pirate text. But I need the full appreciation. I keep saying to you, I'm really shy about being seen and talking to people in public. But this coat needs to be seen. It's got about 30 meters of braid on it and 30 odd buttons. So that's my hope for the renaissance of this show.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And for everybody else, we are going to have a couple of things coming up. So we have this episode. We're also going to have Jay Noves back on the podcast with her narration of her Breakup AU, the first chapter. So we'll be discussing that. We'll be discussing just the experience of audio narration and editing and all of those geeky things. And by that time, hopefully I will have a new fic ready for a full episode, since kind of all of the wrenches have been thrown in the works here. So thank you so much, and I'll catch you next time.
Thank you so much, Alex, for reaching out to me and your constant commentary on the show that challenges me to explore this series from a different perspective, and for your patience through various health-related rescheduling issues. It was truly an honor to get to chat with you. Thank you again so much. And an extra special thank you once again to Tora for her devastating portrait of a Luciferian Flint that she generously donated for the cover art featured online for today's episode. And thank you to all of our listeners. Whether you're returning or joining us for the first time, we appreciate you and we'd love to hear from you. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. It truly does help us to be discovered by more listeners, which helps to shine a brighter spotlight on these amazing artists and creators. And great news, folks, I now have a Patreon. The costs that go into a podcast like this, including commissioning new cover art for each episode, are not insignificant. And in order to keep things running smoothly, I could use a little help from my friends. Just head on over to patreon.com/readingbetweenthelines-podcast. Patreon members will receive early access to the episodes, 3 days early in fact, sneak peeks at the cover art for upcoming episodes, and you'll even be able to submit questions for our upcoming guests, all at the $5 level. If you're a fanfic author and have a favorite story you'd love to hear and want to join me on the podcast, please reach out to me on Twitter @KenterSpring or @AudioficPod, or you can send an email to readingbetweenthelines.pod@gmail.com. If you're not an author, but you've got a favorite fic you'd like me to read, all suggestions are welcome. Please reach out. Thanks again for listening. This has been Reading Between the Lines, a fanfic audio podcast. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.